Keeping a planted tank is by far the most enjoyable hobby out there, but that can really sour up when algae starts to take over your tank. In today's video, I'm going to cover 10 methods that I use to eradicate algae from planted tanks. What up, fish friends? My name is Michael. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Like I mentioned, today's video, I'm going to cover 10 ways that I keep algae down. I maintain planted tanks for a living. I own an aquarium cleaning company. So this is literally what I do day in and day out. These are the tips and tricks that I use to maintain my livelihood. Hopefully it helps you out as well. Whee! The most important thing you can do to keep algae at bay is to grow healthy plants, because algae really only forms on unhealthy plants. When you have a healthy plant, you can kind of think of it as like a boosted immune system. Algae isn't able to cling to the edges of these leaves, and it's not able to really get a foothold and strangle the plant. It's not until the plant starts to become weak and susceptible, it's not growing as fast, that's when algae comes in and really takes over these plants. That's why we see algae, even in a healthy tank, most commonly form on the slow-growing plants, Anubias, Java fern, Bucephalandra, that sort of stuff, because the leaves grow really, really slowly and people don't like to trim them off, right? I'm the same way. I don't like trimming off leaves that take forever to grow. We want those to stick around. Once you get to these really fast growing stem plants, if you get some algae on them, you can clip them and then new heads will grow, and those will be free of algae for the most part. The second thing is keeping a clean water column. Ammonia is absolutely the best friend of algae. If you have any ammonia in your tank, algae is going to devour it and grow exponentially. Other stuff like nitrates, phosphates, magnesium, calcium, all these other nutrients that plants use, we do want to have some of those in the water column, because that ties back into the first thing where you need to have healthy plants to deter algae. Without any nutrients in the water column, your plants are going to grow really, really slowly, making them more susceptible to infiltration of algae. It's kind of a fine line when it comes to a lot of these nutrients in the water column. As far as nitrates are concerned, I like to keep mine at around 20, maybe under. As soon as you start going over that, you risk getting algae in your tank. There are so many different types of lights out there for aquariums. Not every type of light is designed to grow plants. Some of them are just there to provide some lighting for our tanks so we can see our fish, and nothing to do with plant growth. But you think about plants outside, they've evolved to grow with sunlight, and that means that they need certain spectrums or wavelengths of light in order to grow. There's a couple different ways that you can go about finding the right light for plants. Looking at Kelvin isn't the most scientifically sound way to go about lights, but take my word for it that it usually works out when you buy a light that has 6,500 to 7,500 Kelvin. All that means is the color range of the light is kind of in between like a yellow and white light, very similar to the color that the sun puts out. This is going to be great for growing plants. If you want to take it up a notch and really look at what kind of light a plant should use, then you could look at the wavelength of the light. Nanometers is how it's advertised. If you see this chart here, all you're looking for is a spike here, a spike here, and a spike here. You know, not a complete drop off around it. You want to see a pretty decent level of light in some other areas. Without going into too much detail, this is really just providing the pigments in the plant with the right wavelengths they need to photosynthesize. That's how plants produce food for themselves and grow. This light, the right wavelength, basically causes the pigments in the plant to get worked up and to do their job, to shake it the right way, vibrate kind of, in a sense, like simply put. But the wrong wavelength of light essentially just reflects off the plant and doesn't get absorbed and turned into energy. Most LEDs have a tremendously long lifespan, like way longer than we'll be keeping our aquarium, tens of thousands of hours. But if you keep an old type of light, like a fluorescent bulb, the long round ones, or a metal halide, something like that, they do have lifespans and the wavelengths change as time goes on. So if you don't replace them as often as recommended, then algae will step in, because algae isn't really as particular about the wavelength. You can think of algae as an opportunist. When it has any type of light, it's go time, whereas plants really need that specific wavelength. So I think about my time working at generic big box fish store in my neighborhood many years ago, and we had these fluorescent lights all over the ceiling, and they would be on for hours and hours and hours. So even though the tanks had lights on for, like 10 or 12 hours, the lights in the store were on even longer than that. And there was just no way of keeping up with the algae. These bulbs were not really intended for planted tanks, and so they didn't help the plants grow in any of the tanks, but they caused algae to grow like crazy, and it was literally a full-time job staying on top of scrubbing those tanks. The right amount of light, this is equally as important as picking the right light. If you blast too much of the right light on your tank, it will cause algae. I'm a big fan of metaphors, so you can think about it this way. Plants can only consume a certain amount of light. It's kind of like vitamin C in humans. If you consume 10 times the amount of your daily intake, you're just going to piss it out. Plants can only consume so much light. If you give them more than they can use, that's when the algae comes in and grows like crazy. This also ties back in with that first thing I was talking about, growing healthy plants. You provide them with more than they need. Same with humans, you give us more than we need and things go wrong. They don't need tons and tons and tons of light. You can't just get the strongest light you can find and put it on a teeny tiny tank. That's going to cause the algae to grow like crazy. You really want to dial it in to the exact amount of light that the plants can use without algae growth. The best way to do this is just to slowly increase your light. When you first set up a tank, it's a good idea to keep it on the dimmer end. As time goes on, you ramp it up stronger every week. And then when you start to see algae form, you can dial it back a little bit. And that's usually the safest way to prevent a major outbreak from happening. If you go up in large increments, then the second you start seeing algae, it could appear really quickly and rampantly take over your tank. So really ease into your light. One more thing with light is it's important to think about the duration that we keep the light on our tank. If you have a high intensity light, a tank with CO2 and fertilizers and stuff, you want to keep it on the lower end, around 8 hours of light a day. If you're doing a lower intensity light, then you can go up to 12, maybe even 14 hours of light a day. But even with a low intensity light, you're still risking some algae at this point. It's a good rule of thumb to just keep your light on 8 hours a day. Keeping a cleanup crew is one of the most fun ways to control algae. There are so many different critters out there that will help you keep algae at bay, but there's very few critters that will actually eat algae. What am I talking about? How are they helping you keep algae at bay if they're not eating algae? Well, basically what happens is before algae grows, there's this thing called biofilm. If you rub your thumb or finger across the surface of something in your tank that's smooth, you'll notice it's like kind of a slimy residue, the same kind of texture you get when you go to a river or a creek and you pick up a rock that has like that kind of filmy material feeling on it. That is called biofilm. And biofilm is essentially a precursor to algae. Biofilm is just a buildup of organic residue on anything in an aquatic system. That residue is the perfect growing medium for algae. You ever bought a plant that's grown in that in vitro gel, that super high nutrient rich stuff? It's kind of the same concept. That little biofilm nutrient gel helps algae to grow like crazy. The algae crew comes in and eats this biofilm. It tastes really good, and that helps to prevent algae from forming in the first place. There's really only two organisms, in my opinion, that do a terrific job of eating algae. That is the amano shrimp and the autosynclus. These guys will actually go around and eat bits of algae out of the tank. They're not going to eat everything. Green spot algae is not something they're going to touch. Same with blackbeard algae, but hair algae and some other types, they will definitely nibble on that and keep it at bay. Siamese algae eaters are also really, really terrific algae eaters when they're young, but then they quickly grow up and have a real desire for protein heavy foods, frozen stuff, pellets, fish food, or even worse, other members of the algae crew like shrimp. So I wouldn't really recommend Siamese algae eaters unless you're keeping a really big tank and you don't have any shrimp in there. Some other really fun ones that help to keep biofilm down are bristlenose plecostomus, other types of dwarf plecos, cherry shrimp, caridina shrimp, basically any type of small shrimp that's going to go around nibbling on little things. My absolute favorite though are cherry shrimp, because they'll breed in your tank. You don't have to spend a fortune buying 1,000 shrimp. You know, you can buy a dozen or 2 dozen cherry shrimp, throw them in a big tank, and as long as there's nothing and they're eating them, they will reproduce like crazy. A good filter with a lot of flow is something that people don't talk about often enough when it comes to algae. There's a few reasons that flow is really important for keeping algae down. A couple of them relate back to that first one that I keep talking about because it's so important, growing healthy plants. Flow is really important for plants because it allows for gas exchange around the tank. It's pumping CO2 to the plants, you know, even if you're not injecting CO2, they're getting it from the atmosphere, they're getting it from the fish respiration, and then you know, from the substrate layer as well. If there's bacteria that are respiring in there, flow is going to distribute nutrients to those plants. And then flow is also going to help prevent that biofilm building up on top of the plants. So really great idea. Even if your filter doesn't have a ton of flow in it, you can add a supplementary wave maker or pump to increase the flow in the tank. That will help the filter pick up all of those like suspended particles in the water column before they can settle on the plants. I got a old filter on that side of the tank that's really not pumping like it used to. So I stuck a pump in there, and that helps to keep the water going, and it sends stuff directly to the intake. And if you do blast your plants with more flow than they need, again, that's tying back into the first thing. They're not going to like it. They're not going to grow well. Algae is going to form. So find the right amount of flow is critical. Micronutrients are something that a lot of people underestimate. There's a big trend in the hobby now to keep kind of low maintenance tanks. And that's a real fun way to keep tanks because then you don't have to do as much work. One of the things that ties in with low maintenance tanks is not dumping in tons of nutrients into the tank, not using fertilizers, because the fish provide plants with nutrients, and then by the plants consuming the fish nutrients, we kind of have this ecosystem where we're not having to do as much, put as much chemicals in the tank, do as much maintenance, all this stuff. One thing that I do think is overlooked though with regards to this is micronutrients. Fish produce a lot of macronutrients as waste. These macronutrients are like the big building blocks that plants use. Micronutrients are really important for maintaining functions inside the plants, complicated chemical processes, photosynthesis, osmoregulation, and then other things that are like way beyond what we need to be talking about today. It's important to know that micronutrients are really, really important, and just the presence of macronutrients will not allow for healthy plant growth. A little bit of micronutrient dosing can go a long way. How do we get micronutrients in the tank? It's very easy. We can buy micronutrients as a liquid pump that we pump in the tank. My go-to is Nylock G. They sell both macro and micronutrients so that we can dose them individually, or we can avoid one altogether. This is another one that a lot of people avoid because they want to keep their tank simple, keep the cost down, and keep it maintenance kind of on the lower end, not having to trim your plants as much. So these people might not be so into CO2, but if you're really, really struggling with algae, then I think CO2 is a terrific option. And you don't have to be pumping your tank full of CO2 so much that you're worried about your fish suffocating, because there certainly is a level of CO2 that becomes harmful for your fish. But really small amounts can go a long way. And again, CO2 ties back to that first thing I talked about, growing healthy plants, which is essentially what this whole video is about. CO2 allows your plants to utilize more nutrients from the water column. It allows your plants to utilize more light. And so you run less risk of blasting too much light or too much nutrients in your tank. You turbocharge your plants, you enable them to consume everything around them. And this not only helps by keeping the water column clean and out competing algae, so there's no excess light for algae to grow, it's all being utilized. It also helps to grow crazy, crazy healthy plants, which are just out competing the algae like no one's business. So again, there's no need to put CO2 in your tank if you're happy with the way things look. But you're watching this video, you've made it to bullet point number 9, which means you probably have some algae in your tank. Consider using a little bit of CO2. You don't have to buy an expensive system. There's DIY setups. Leave a link in the description for another video that goes over a couple different options for setting up like a $30 CO2 system for your planet tank. Last but not least, get your hands dirty. It's only a matter of time before you get a serious infestation of algae in your tank, algae bloom, or as I like to say, algae storm. Even the most experienced fish keepers, someone like myself who's been doing this for 30 years, owns a business, does this day in and day out, I deal with big algae storms because it's just something that happens when we grow plants. We give them all these things that algae likes, and every now and then things spiral out of control. Not to worry though, you don't need to beat yourself up. Just get in there. Hair algae, you can physically grab, twist, pull, use a brush to grab it out, spiral it out, or you can cut the leaves, you can scrape it off the glass, siphon the water. There's so many different ways to remove algae from a tank. You're going to need to physically, manually do that yourself. And then you need to really address the root cause. If you remove the algae, but you don't fix any of the issues that are causing algae, it's just gonna come back every time. So remove the algae and then use some of the things that I've talked about in this video. Do you have algae because your light's on 20 hours a day? Well, then remove all the algae, lower the light to 8 hours, and see how that works. Lower the intensity, use a little fertilizer, try CO2. You know, you get it. Just try something. Don't keep doing the same thing because you're gonna get the same results. And it actually might even get worse because the more algae you have, the more it can reproduce and exponentially grow. So really nip it in the bud before it gets out of control. Let me know, what are some tips and tricks that you use to keep algae down in your tank? Hopefully you found this video helpful, at least a little bit. If you did, hit that like, subscribe, all that stuff we always talk about. If you want to support the channel, buy something from an affiliate link or some free ways, just watch some other videos. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I'll leave links for other relevant videos, things I touched on in this video, as well as another algae guide that looks at the 7 big types of algae and specific causes for each type, even though this video does cover a lot of those things in some way, shape, or form. This one might be helpful if you have just one type that's causing you a headache. Hey, thanks so much. Until next time, see ya.